everyone. This is Dr. Vishal Gyawali from Queen's University, Kingston, Canada, and it's my big pleasure and honor today to be speaking about access to cancer drugs in low and middle income countries. These are my disclosures. So when we are talking about access to cancer drugs, there are two parts of that equation. One is about availability of cancer drugs and the other is affordability. And these are not necessarily the same thing. So when we talk about availability, why are cancer drugs not available in many countries in the world? So first, it can be due to delay due to regulatory sluggishness. The industry may not have enough financial motivation to apply for approval of cancer drug in that population. And there might be regulatory inability in the local setting to assess new cancer drugs and just regulatory sluggishness. And since most low and middle income countries lack the capacity to produce or manufacture these drugs by themselves, they also need to rely on importing these drugs from other neighboring countries. And those issues can lead to substantial delay as well. And even in high income countries, we have seen that it takes up to 1 to 2 years to have access to the drug even after regulatory approval is already in place. So WHO produces a list called the Essential Medicine List, which includes cancer drugs that the WHO deems to be essential for providing basic cancer care throughout the world. And all the countries in the world, they produce their own national essential medicine list. And this study from 2016 looked at how congruent the national essential medicine list is with the WHO list for cancer drugs. And we can see that even for game-changing treatments like trastuzumab, only 19% of the countries out of 135 countries in this study had included this drug in their own national essential medicine list. Even for drugs like oxaliplatin and gemcitabine, this classical cytotoxic chemotherapy, only less than 40% of the countries had these drugs in their national EML essential medicine list. Now again, having a drug included in the EML list does not guarantee that that drug will be available, but it does show the commitment of the country towards prioritization of that drug. And even that seems to be very, very subpar in terms of how many countries are able to make these drugs available. ESMO did a very nice study looking at the availability and accessibility of several cancer drugs in the EML list. And this is what they found. The countries in green at the bottom of the table represent the low income countries, and for most of the drugs we can see that these countries are coded either red or black. Red indicates that this drug is available by paying full cost of the treatment by patients, and black means it's not available. So even these drugs in the EML list, they are either not available or available only by paying full cost. They went a step further and they asked what the barriers were for accessibility to these drugs. And again, if we look at the countries in the low income region, we see that most of these countries are coded either white, that means there is no specific barrier to report, or blue, which reflects no supplier or unreliable supplier. Next, let's talk about affordability. We have seen that even for these classical cancer drugs, they can either be inaccessible to the patients in low and middle income countries or unaffordable. We did a survey in Nepalese patients with acute leukemia, and the treatments for acute leukemia are usually classical old generic drugs. But even for those patients, we found that patients were suffering severe financial toxicity as a result of cancer treatment. Almost 3/4 of our patients had extreme financial toxicity. That means they were asking money for charity from the public, they were borrowing loans subject to very high interest rates from friends or relatives, or even selling property like house or land or livestock to support their cancer treatment. So yes, when we talk about affordability, we talk about modern cancer drugs, which are quite expensive. But the fact is, low and middle income countries lack access or affordability to even old generic cancer drugs that are already in the WHO EML list. Next, about cost of cancer drugs. So when we are talking about cost of cancer drugs, there are two important questions to ask. One is, why are cancer drugs so expensive? The industry claims that it is due to the high R&D costs. Is that really true? And the second is, are cancer drugs actually cheaper in low and middle income countries? Because people keep citing cancer drugs are cheaper in low and middle income countries, and that's why the drug prices are high in high income countries. So there was a fantastic study done by Daniel Goldstein and colleagues looking at the price of cancer drugs and affordability of cancer drugs in different income strata countries in the world. And as you can see in this left side graph, countries like India and China, the cost of the price of cancer drugs is quite low compared to countries like USA where the price is very high. But if you compare that price in terms of GDP of the country, then the price seems very unaffordable in countries like India and China versus other high-income countries. So I had written an editorial about these results, which was titled "Cancer Drugs in Low and Middle Income Countries: Cheap but Unaffordable." So yes, the drug prices per se are lower; they are cheap, but they are quite unaffordable compared to the purchasing capacity of the local population. And the WHO group did a fantastic study and published this in JAMA Open a couple of years ago, where they looked at the R&D costs for a given cancer drug and how much those costs were recouped. And they found that per dollar invested for R&D of these cancer drugs, there was a median return of $14.5. And within 5 years, most of these drugs were able to fully recover the maximum possible risk-adjusted cost. So cancer drugs are not expensive because of the R&D costs, but because of high profit margin. While we are talking about access to these cancer drugs, we also need to ask a question: does access mean access to any cancer drug or access to meaningful cancer drugs? And this aligns with the philosophy of cancer groundshot that I have been talking about for a long time now. Because lack of access to these new fancy cancer drugs should not detract us from lack of access to meaningful cancer drugs and curative services like surgery or radiation. And this is the approach of cancer groundshot, which attempts to ensure that meaningful drugs and meaningful curative services are available for patients globally before we talk about access to these newer cancer drugs that may provide only marginal benefit. For example, lack of access to trastuzumab for breast cancer or immunotherapy for melanoma, they are a big deal. But lack of access to neratinib for breast cancer or regorafenib for colon cancer, this should not be our priority. So when we are talking about access to cancer drugs, we are talking about access to meaningful cancer drugs. But the question is how to prioritize then. So there are different tools available. So there are different factors to consider. One is the magnitude of clinical benefit from the drug and its cost. In other words, the value of the cancer drug, and also the disease burden in the local setting. What disease is a priority disease, and whether there are facilities to diagnose accurately or not. Like for biomarker-based treatments, if the biomarker cannot be diagnosed accurately, then there is no point in having access to drugs that are based on those biomarkers, and whether there are resources available to manage toxicities or not. And in order to assess magnitude of clinical benefit, we also have different tools available. WHO AML list can function as the first basic list of drugs that the government can ensure patients will have access to, and the other, to prioritize other cancer drugs, they can also use the ESMO magnitude of clinical benefit scale. So what are some important steps that can be taken to improve access or affordability for these cancer drugs? One is price transparency, because this study that compared the cancer drug prices in 16 European countries, Australia and New Zealand, so that for the same cancer drug, there was substantial difference in what the countries were paying. Between the highest priced country and the lowest priced country, the difference in drug price was up to 388%. So a simple transparency in drug prices can lead to better negotiations for the countries. And the second is universal health coverage. Unfortunately, a lot of low and middle income countries in the world do not have universal health coverage, and patients pay as the expenses out of pocket. But data clearly show that the government procurement prices for drugs are far less than what private sector patients pay. Even for generic products, private sector patients pay 9 to 25 times of the international reference prices. The third is having an HTA body and regulating prices. The best example comes from comparing United States that does not have a HTA body with Canada that does have an HTA body. And in this paper, we compared the cancer drugs that were approved by FDA versus recommended for funding by PCODER, which is an HTA organization in Canada. And we saw that cancer drugs that were funded in Canada, in general, had better quality evidence, were improving overall survival by a better margin, and had more substantial clinical benefit than that in United States. And again, if you compare for prices, United States versus United Kingdom, and again, UK has an HTA body and does price negotiation, unlike United States. And studies show that the launch price in US is far higher than that in UK. And the annual increase in prices post-launch is also 8.8% in the United States versus only 0.3% in the United Kingdom. So other approaches to improving affordability could include public-private partnerships, industry responsibility, philanthropy. One good example comes from the Glivec International Patient Assistance Program, which was a collaboration between Novartis and the Max Foundation to deliver imatinib free for several patients throughout the world. And this can form as a model for other similar cooperations. And then participation in clinical trials. We argue that participating in clinical trials is an important way by which patients in low and middle income countries can access newer treatments. But we need to remember that all clinical trials are not created equal. I'll give you an example. This trial of cemiplimab for patients with non-small cell lung cancer with PD-L1 of at least 50% was a global trial conducted in several countries, including low and middle income countries and upper and middle income countries. And this trial randomized patients to receive cemiplimab, which is an immunotherapy, versus chemotherapy. Now, chemotherapy was already proven to be inferior, and immunotherapy, a different immunotherapy, pembrolizumab, was proven to be superior for the same exact group of patients in 2016. But this trial led to the approval of this newer immunotherapy by the FDA. But this was a trial conducted mostly in low and middle income countries using a substandard chemotherapy control arm. So can access to the new drug in low and middle income countries justify conducting a trial that would not have been considered ethical in high income countries? And actually, there has been a recent study that shows that this access argument does not hold water, because they looked at drugs that led to FDA approval that were conducted out of United States as well. And they saw that within 1 year of FDA approval, only 13% of high income countries and 0% of low and middle income countries or upper middle income countries had access to the drug. Within 5 years, this percentage is increased slightly, but only less than a quarter of low and middle income countries had access to these drugs within 5 years of the drug getting FDA approval based on trial that came from these countries. So low and middle income countries should rather focus on investing in meaningful clinical trials. What does that mean? I'll give you an example from COVID. For COVID, we have two different treatments. One is remdesivir, which has provided only marginal mortality benefit but costs substantially. But dexamethasone, where mortality benefit is substantial but costs very cheap and is affordable across the world. So low and middle income countries should focus on these dexamethasone type trials rather than focusing on remdesivir type trials. And actually, there have been plenty of examples of these sort of trials that the results of which would be immediately applicable to several low and middle income countries. And one more word is about Me Too drugs. There has been some evidence to see that a locally developed Me Too product can help in price negotiation. As shown in this example, when China developed its own EGFR TKI ikotinib, the prices of gefitinib and erlotinib also went down. And one more technique or one more strategy is about compulsory licensing and importing of generics. So several low and middle income countries in the world have tried to exercise this power given by the TRIPS agreement from the World Trade Organization, in which they issue compulsory licensing for life-saving cancer drugs. And just as an example, when Thailand issued compulsory licensing for docetaxel, letrozole, and erlotinib, by this alone, they saved $140 million in 5 years. But more than that, this compulsory licensing can be used as a negotiating chip to discount the prices. And our final word is about quality of drugs, because fake cancer drugs and substandard quality cancer drugs is now a problem in several low and middle income countries. And because these cost substantially low than the original molecule, um, they are flooding the market in low and middle income countries. But this is a problem because access to counterfeit medications is worse than no access at all. So we have to keep an eye on this as well. So in conclusion, access depends on availability and affordability, but we need a strong political will and international cooperation to ensure availability of essential cancer medicines. And several strategies are available. However, prioritization is important, and participation in meaningful ground shot type clinical trials should be encouraged. And we should also keep an eye on counterfeit medications, which is a unique challenge in low and middle income countries. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions.